Dr. Walter Block, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm under the impression that I have a contractual obligation to call you Walter. It was non-negotiable, and here we are. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on your show.
So, for people in the audience that don't know who you are, they actually may know who you are through inference, different things that I've said over the years as I talk about economic things. You're an economics professor, you're a doctor of economics. Many people don't know that there are different schools of thought when it comes to economics. And I would love to get into this, but for people who maybe have heard some of the things that I've said, I quote you quite often when explaining some of the basic things about economics that some people just don't seem to have a grasp on. One, my favorite one that I quote is always the pickle wanting chicken farmers or pickle wanting chicken farmers and the chicken wanting pickle farmers. This is the double coincidence of wants. This is an economic theory. This is the idea in a what would you call it, a barter system, how you have a problem and this is where we need means of exchange. Money comes into play, and these are the great things. I love discussing these things because for some reason I get excited over economics. I know it's strange, I know it's funny, but it's one of the things that I do. I dork out on this, and I listen to hundreds of hours of your podcasts. So I didn't realize you're in the neighborhood. You spend the summers in Vancouver.
Yeah, North Vancouver. And we're two weirdos, I guess. We both like economics and politics from a libertarian point of view.
So the libertarian point of view, and this is what I kind of want to get into, and I want to give people this concept that there are different schools of thought. We live in Canada. Many of the audience lives in Canada, where they think that economics is spending all of our tax earned or tax dollars on everything, and into the point of spending money that we haven't even collected yet in taxes, deficit spending, on and on and on. Many people will call this the broken window fallacy. We have to spend money for the economy to get moving, and there are different schools of thought. So give us a little rundown on Austrian economics versus perhaps the mainstream, I guess, would be John Maynard Keynes theory that a lot of politicians tend to like.
Well, I suppose I could break it down into four. One would be Austrian, another one would be Chicagoan, a third would be Keynesian, and a fourth would be Marxist. Uh,
Okay.
the Austrian it's got nothing to do with the economics of the country Austria. It's just that the people who started it all were in Austria. Menger, von der Werk, Mises, Hayek, all are Austrian economists because they, at one time or another, were in Austria. It's very similar to the Chicago School of Economics. It's got nothing to do with the economics of the city of Chicago. It's just that Milton Friedman and Stigler and Becker were all there at the University of Chicago. That's why it's called the Chicago School. The third one would be, I guess, Keynesianism, left-wing mainstream economics. Some people break it down into, what is it? Saltwater economists, freshwater economists, and no water economists.
All
So
right.
saltwater economists would be MIT and Harvard and Stanford and Berkeley because they're near salt water.
I
Uh,
see.
Freshwater would be Chicago, the Great Lakes. No water would be Murray Rothbard, who was at UNLV, University of Las Vegas, Nevada at Las Vegas. There's no water.
Right.
So some people break it down that way. So let me
And then
mention.
there's the no resources. That would be the Marxist idea.
I didn't
That
see
would be just sorry we ran out of stuff. Wait in line.
Yeah.
We all know how that economic policy, central authority, is the way that works. And well, we discovered this years ago that the price mechanism was something that you couldn't replicate in a central authority. You couldn't have these market signals that entrepreneurs can look at and see, oh, I should be producing more of these things. I should be making these widgets instead of these widgets. And with a central authority, well, we've been seeing it in China over and over and over again, where they implement making bicycles, and now they have mountains of bicycles in the garbage, and they implement doing this, and you have mountains of that in the garbage, and they can't really get a good grasp on moving things forward. So give a like what can you tell the audience is the difference between, say, for example, laissez-faire, the idea of leave it alone economics, to maybe more of a not central authority but managed economy?
Well, let me just finish the uh, four different schools of thought.
Oh, okay, for sure.
Okay. Taking them from the bottom up, the Marxists are predicated on the labor theory of value, that
Right.
things have value insofar as labor is inputted into them. And labor accounts for something like three-quarters of the GDP. And and what they say, the Marxists, is that the capitalists are stealing one quarter of the GDP from the workers, because the workers should get all of the GDP. Uh, Land makes no contribution, capital makes no contribution, entrepreneurship makes no contribution. But the labor theory of value is wrong.
Hmm.
They are valuable not in so far as labor is inputted into them. I can pick up a gold nugget big as my fist, and it's worth a lot, and there was very little labor put into it. And then you have the mud pie and the cherry pie, the same amount of labor, and the cherry pie is worth a lot, and the mud pie isn't worth anything. So we have to dismiss Marxism.
Right. And you know what I've always appreciated is the fact that in a free society where we have voluntary exchange, you can try your socialist experiments. You can run co-ops, you can try these things out and see how they work out. And what I've noticed with a lot of co-ops, when they do try them out, what you have is some of the labor force will say, "You know what, I prefer to get a paycheck, a guaranteed paycheck, over the risk, and maybe having to put my money back into the business, so why don't I sell my shares to one of the other guys?" And then soon enough it ends up becoming just like a normal enterprise where only a few of them hold the shares in the enterprise, and it goes right back to the way it would be. But in a socialist, an authoritarian governance, you can't have your experiments with the free market. It's just not possible. It's disallowed. So you wouldn't be able to have that. And this is what I like to focus on a lot when it comes to economics, and teaching people with my platform, with the audience that I have, is the idea that well, the market economy and liberty are intertwined. You can't have one function without the other being there. You need to have the idea of property rights, the idea that contracts need to be upheld, or the market ceases to function. You don't get this in communist countries. Well, you might see a sort of it trying to happen, but always gets squashed down by corruption and things like that take place in these types of systems of governance.
Well, you made a very good point that prices are crucial to enabling us to cooperate with each other, which leads to the question, well, how did the Soviet Union last from 1917 to, I don't know, 1989? You'd think they would have gone bust long before that, but they did have access to prices, namely Sears and Roebuck catalog, or they just look at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and they can use those prices to help them not pile up millions of bicycles and no shoes, or vice versa. So you're quite right that market-based prices are very, very important. And without them, you just sort of the blind leading the blind, and you have no economic rationality.
I had no idea that they actually did. Is that a fact? They actually would pull out Sears catalogs and price their things based on that?
I don't know if they did Sears catalog, or all I know is that Weston prices were available to them. But
Wow.
imagine that the whole world was socialistic and there were no market prices anywhere. Well, then it would be the blind leading the blind, and we could pile up bicycles, not have enough shoes. See, in the market, if we had a lot of bicycles and no shoes, the price of bicycles would fall, uh, helping people, or getting people to produce fewer bicycles. And if we have hardly any shoes, the price of shoes would rise, and then people would have an incentive to produce more shoes. That's why in Canada or the US or Western Europe or any country that has markets, you don't have millions of carrots and no peas. You have some sort of balance because profits and private property rights tend to push us in the direction of what people actually want, what the consumers want.
It's amazing. It's amazing how the market works and how the market functions. It may be a long read for a lot of people, but Ludwig von Mises's book, Human Action, is a treatise basically stating that this is how the markets function. You know, people act or they don't act. The action of not buying something is in fact an action. It tells every entrepreneur that's looking for your patronage, he didn't want any of my stuff. Okay, maybe we should look at something else. This is how the market works. What I found was a beauty in the Austrian school, how they described things. It almost feels like an allegory. Like you could like write an allegory of how the market economy is like its own ecosystem in a way where you know, it can be fragile at times. Like things can, you know, go up, you know, boom bust cycles, these kinds of things. But it's almost like it works on its own, and as soon as you come in and make some changes to this, like say with government regulation, things like that, it creates ripples in the pond, or you know, drops a couple of goldfish in the pond perhaps, and next thing you know, you have all these goldfish, and everybody turns to the government for more answers. Why is it that the government is not the right answer for this?
Well, you know, libertarianism is a many splendored thing. It's got many different aspects to it. And the anarcho-capitalist libertarian would say government is evil, government is an abomination, and we shouldn't have any government. Most libertarians would say, well, we should have government, but it should be very limited. Armies to keep foreign bad guys off of us, police to keep local bad guys off of us, and courts to determine who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. So the libertarian ethos is at least to have very little government, and it should just be to protect personal rights. You know, no murder, no rape, no theft, no arson, no kidnapping, and that's it. And the government shouldn't do anything more than that. And sort of government is like a fire. If it stays in the fireplace, it's good. If it gets around the house, all over the house, not so good. So the idea most libertarians would say is we want limited government. The government to just pay for armies, courts, and police, and very little else, and then keep its mitts off of everything else. No minimum wage, no rent control, no tariffs, no regulation, no antitrust, and let the economy be free. I used to work for the Fraser Institute, located in Vancouver, Canada, and we did a study of 120 countries or so, and we rated the economic freedom of all of them. And then we looked at the per capita wealth or the per capita income, and you'll be amazed. I'm glad you're sitting down because you'll be shocked that the more free the country is, the richer it is. And not only the richer it is, but the faster it's growing in wealth. So, you know, if you want to cure poverty, and most people want to cure poverty, embrace laissez-faire capitalism. And most people just don't see that.
Well, I would take it one step further because a lot of people have environmentalism on the mind, and a lot of even our government politicians, they talk about, you know, we got to clean up our act, we got to make things better. But what they're doing is they're impoverishing us with their economic policies, which is actually getting people to not care about the environment. People will care about the environment. Say, for example, you know, you're worried about feeding your family. You're worried about bringing food home. You're worried about keeping a shelter over your family's head. The last thing you care about is the environment. But it's once you become wealthy, once you're doing better, you got a little bit more free time, you start looking around the place, you say, this place is a dump. Let's take care of this. Because I think that we should have most people want to live in a clean environment, but it's for example, in China right now, you can barely breathe in most of the cities. There's so much industry going on around them, but there, you don't see a lot of people raising a fuss because they're just trying to get out of poverty. The same thing in places like India or other places, third world countries around the world. But here in Canada, people are they're primed to really care about the environment, but the more and more they grow worried about their finances, the less and less they're concerned about that in the end.
Well, I think you make a very good point, and sometimes we even have an aphorism to encapsulate what you're saying, and the aphorism is wealthier is healthier. Namely, if
I
you
like
want
that.
to have a good environment, let's not be poor. Because if you're poor, you're worried about the next meal. You're not worried about the air quality or anything like that.
Well, I guess it's like the Hollywood, if we just lived like the natives did, thousands of years ago, then we'll all be happy and prosperous. Obviously, that's a Hollywood tale. If you're giant blue people on a planet far, far away, maybe that works, but not here on Earth and with humankind. It's an interesting one there.
Well, one of the roles of government that most libertarians would support would be a law against trespass. Now, look, suppose I take my garbage, my eggshells, my orange peels, banana peels, coffee grounds, and I dump them on your front lawn. Now, if you're a nice guy, you're not going to call the cops. You're going to call the mental authorities and try to get me some help because you would come to me and say, "Hey, what have you just done? You was it a mistake? Were you drunk?" If you were a nice neighbor, if you're not a nice neighbor, you call the cops because what I just did was trespass, and
Hmm.
trespass is a violation of property rights. Now, suppose instead of dumping my macro garbage on your front lawn, first I incinerate it and I burn it, and now I send it over to your front lawn in the form of little dust particles. Has anything changed? No, it's still trespass. So,
Hmm.
part of a legitimate government function, if there is any such thing, would be to make sure that people don't trespass dust particles onto the property of other people. And what you should do if I'm a let's say Pittsburgh where they make steel and you're going to have a lot of pollution there.
Hmm.
Well, if we libertarians believe in homesteading, the rightful owner of the property is the one who first homesteaded it, mixed his labor with it. Well, if the steel mill was there first, and let's say the steel mill operates a quarter of a mile, but it pollutes in 10 square miles. Well, if they were there first, then they have a right to pollute. And if you move in, you can't sue them. It's sort of like an
Hmm.
airport. The airports make noise. And if you're, I don't know, a violinist and you need absolute quiet, and you move in right next to the airport, and then you start suing them for having planes that make noise. Well, no, they own that right to pollute noise pollution. Or if you're a pig farmer and pigs smell badly, but you were there first, and now I move next door to you and I sue you for stink, the pig smell, whatever. That would that would
Yeah.
be that would be improper. So the libertarian private property rights theory is a way of addressing environmental problems, and I think it's a much better way of addressing environmental problems than the left-wing environmentalists. The what is it? They're really watermelons. Why watermelons? Green on the outside, red on the inside, and they want to
Yeah.
run everybody's lives. You can't have a plastic bag, and you must what do you call it? Take sort your garbage out so that you put the paper here and the plastic there and the metal there, and they have all sorts of rules. Um, uh, in North Van, I'm not sure what it's like in Squamish, but you have to uh, take your garbage and put it in all these categories, which takes forever. Now, in the market, we do have that sort of a thing. Like if you're a goldsmith, you're not going to let little pieces of gold fall on the floor. You're going to
Mm.
conserve them. But we should have a market, and sometimes newsprint is recycled because of the prices, and other times we just throw it away because the price system is very important in every aspect of the economy.
One thing I really appreciate about economics and the theory of economics is you come up with theories like the idea of uh, unintended consequences. So the law of unintended consequences. So on the same thread, there was, incidentally, I think about 100 years ago now, there was trains that were, they built tracks and they put it right through farmland. And these trains were blowing soot all over these farmers' farmland. And so the farmers would sue and they would reach settlements. They would, get courts to tell the train company to pay out. Okay, well, we got to pay out. So this became a cost to the train operation, the company for operating their trains. And so then they started working on rudimentary emissions devices to stop the soot from going up in the air. And that all came to an end when the government said, you know what? This is for the greater good. That the train is going by your farm, and you know what? You're just going to have to put up with it. And so this is kind of the law of unintended consequences. When the government comes in and says, we think this is eminent domain, we think that this is more important for everybody to have this, and you can't sue the train company. Well, it's stopped environmental protections from happening in a free market sense.
If you're going to be sued, you put some sort of grid in your smokestack that captures the soot or captures 95% of it. We have a law about de minimis. If it's very small, the law can't take account of it. For example, we exhale, and we exhale poisons. And what should we do? Stop exhaling? That's so if you can get rid of 95, 98% of the soot, that's pretty good, and that's all we can usually account for. But you mentioned unintended consequences, which is a very, very important part of economics. My favorite example of that is the minimum wage law. Minimum wage law, I don't know what it is in Canada, $15 or $20 an hour, something like that. And
It's been a minute since I've earned minimum wage, so I always hear the arguments on minimum wage and how they should bring it up. My argument always is, why not $1,000 an hour? I think everybody should make $1,000. If this is really going to bring people out of poverty, that's probably the quickest and easiest way to do it. Would you not think?
Absolutely. Excellent point. I mean, we should stop foreign aids of poor countries. Just tell them, hey, raise your minimum wage. You'll be rich. You won't need any foreign aid. No, you're absolutely right. People think that minimum wage is sort of like a floor, and the higher you raise it, the richer people will be. Then the refutation is, we'll have about 1,000 or 10,000 an hour. Then we'll all be very rich. No, the minimum wage is not like a floor raising wages. It's rather like a barrier over which you have to jump to get a job in the first place. And the higher it is, the harder it is to jump over. I mean, if we had say a $50 an hour minimum wage, the unemployment rate would, I don't know, it would be so high, it would unemploy everyone whose productivity is less than $50 an hour. Because why does the employer want to hire the employee in the first place? Because his receipts go up by a certain amount based on the productivity. So if you're very productive, you'll have a high wage. If you're middle class productive, you'll have middle class income. And if you ask people if they want fries with that, or you push a broom, your productivity is a little lower and your wage will be lower. So the people whose productivity is below the minimum wage are unemployable. So if the minimum wage law is $20 an hour and you can produce 15 an hour, you can't be hired, because if I hire you, I'll lose $5 an hour. And this is horrendous, and yet most people don't understand economics.
Well, and this is why we don't have things like full serve gasoline stations anymore. It just doesn't. They just don't exist because the minimum wage has gone up so far that young kids who are just looking for experience. I mean, that's really all your first job should ever be for. It's not about you striking a gold mine and now you're going to be trading on the stock exchange in 2 years. Like, no, this is you getting a little bit of experience of what it's like to show up on time, what it's like to stick it out through a whole day of work and then go home and feel tired. I mean, I know it sounds terrible, but it's morale that you're actually you're making people, or people are discovering what morale is in that sense. Now, I wanted to get into another point about economics, and this is the idea of scale. So oftentimes you'll hear from people wearing their smart cap. They'll say, well, you know what? That just doesn't scale at that. You're talking about a macro scale of economics, and you're talking about the big economies and the fundamentals of a big economy. It doesn't the rules are totally different anymore. They don't apply on a big scale as they would on a small scale. So what would you say about that?
Well, I think economics is it's the same. I mean, on the piano, there are very high notes and very low notes, and yet the same principles apply to all of them. So I would say economics applies to the macro and to the micro. You did mention before about the business cycles, up and down, and here the Austrians diverge from the mainstream. See, what the mainstream says is the economy is sort of like a car on a very narrow road. And on the one side is unemployment, and on the other side is inflation. And it's the government's role to keep the car on the road so you don't have either one of these things. But what happens if you have both? We sometimes have inflation and unemployment, and they just have no answer to that. And here you get a divergence between the Chicago school and the Keynesian schools. They're both Keynesians in the sense that they buy into this narrow road and car sort of a thing. And they only diverge whether it should be monetary or fiscal policy. The Chicagoans are monetarists, and they think that the way to keep the car on the straight and narrow is through government monetary policy through a central bank. The Keynesians, the left-wing Keynesians, think it's fiscal policy. The Austrians have a very different view. We don't think that you're going to have this problem of one or the other. We think that the reason you have booms and busts is because the government messes around with the interest rate in the first place. And if the government didn't do that, then we wouldn't have booms and busts. And we look back, I mean, in the US, the Fed was created in 1913. And if you look back before the Fed was created, there were no booms and busts, or well, there were some, like if you had a volcano or a storm or something like that, but there was no regular up and down. But it's sort of like when you get drunk, the night before, things are good, but then you pay a price in the morning after. You have a headache or stomach ache or whatever. And the Austrians look at this very differently. What we say is the boom is the bad part. The boom is when you're getting drunk and you're misallocating resources. The bust is the good thing because now you get rid of the body poisons. So it's the exact opposite. And the way the mainstream looks at this is we have to have more booms and we can't allow any bankruptcies. And that's why the Great Depression lasted so long, because Franklin Delano Roosevelt kept bailing out all sorts of businesses that shouldn't have been in business in the first place and were only called into business because the interest rates were artificially lowered. So here you get a divergence between the Austrian school, the Chicago school, and the saltwater Keynesian school.
What I found most fascinating was when reading Mises's theory of money and credit. He was the first to come up, I think he was the first to come up with this idea that made why interest rates are what they are make sense. Like most people will say, well, you know, you ask them, well, why is the interest rate what it is? And they say, well, the Bank of Canada decided that. And I think that's a terrible answer, because I think that there's a market function for this, where a lot of people didn't understand this. And even back in the day, you know, even religions came up with laws about usury to say that it's bad to charge interest because there was no real good explanation for it. But then Mises came along and he said, ah, you've misunderstood one aspect of it. You have your supply and you have your demand, but you haven't figured it out. It's about time. There's a time preference. There's the I want money now so I can spend it now so I can do the things that I want to do with it now. And so I'm willing to pay a surplus on not having to save up my money and buy that thing later. I want to borrow it from somebody who happens to have that liquid asset, the liquid cash that I can borrow it from for. And if there's enough people in the market that have liquid savings that they can lend out to you, then that would be the supply in the marketplace. And how many entrepreneurs need to borrow money to start a business or do whatever that is, that would be the demand. So now you actually have a supply and demand curve that works perfectly. And it's such an eloquent answer to the idea of what interest rates are. But this is still not how we talk about interest rates. We're still looking to these central authorities, these central banks, to allocate the interest rate, the prime rate, so that we can all figure this out. But this leads to, like you said, the boom bust cycle because of this. So when the Bank of Canada is coming up with interest rates, what orifice are they pulling these rates out of?
No, that's a very, very elegant way of putting it. Look, I usually promise people a half hour, and we're closing in on a half hour. So let's
absolutely.
Have one last comment or question.
I wanted to ask about the interest rates. How is it that the Bank of Canada comes up with their interest rates, and why is this not a good market decision? And why is it that we should actually just switch to the idea that the market determines interest rates?
Well, let me take a hack at that. There is such a thing called present discounted value. So what's present discounted value? Present discounted value is what is money worth if it's receivable in a year from now. Suppose I have an auction and I have a dollar bill here, and I want to know what should be the value of that, and what should the market value of that be. Now, people will prefer the dollar right, and assume that the dollar in a year from now will be given to you for sure, and there'll be no inflation. So the question comes, well, what will you bid for it? Well, if you bid 25 cents, that'll be a really good, you'll make a lot of profit that way. But then I'll bid 26 cents and I'll outbid you. And someone will bid 27 cents. Now, suppose the rate of interest is 5%. That means that if you put 95 cents in the bank right now, at a 5% interest rate, you'll get $1 in a year from now. So nobody would bid more than 95 cents, and anyone bidding less than 95 cents, somebody will outbid them. Namely, the present discounted value of $1 receivable in a year from now at 5% is 95 cents. That's what present discounted value is. Now, suppose that the government lowers the rate of interest from 5% to 4%. Well, now the present discounted value of $1 receivable in a year from now is 96 cents. Because if you put 96 cents in the bank at 4%, you'll get $1. So if the government lowers the rate of interest from 5% to 4%, this will encourage people to have investments of 1 year duration, because they'll make a little bit more money. They'll make 1% more. They'll make 96 cents instead of 95 cents. Fine. But what about investments that will last 20 years? What will happen there? Well, there you're going to have a much wider divergence between 5% and 4%. People will be led as if by an invisible hand to start producing round about processes of production that will take 20 years to produce, but the savings rate of the people hasn't changed. Just because the government lowered the interest rate doesn't mean savings rates have increased, and it doesn't mean that we can now afford to have investments of 20-year duration. And that's why and that's the boom when we have all these great investments that won't come to fruition for 20 years. But the point is that we can't afford them and they're going to go broke. And that's the bust. So this would be why it's very important to allocate resources in proportion to the people's time preference, their time preference rate. And if it's 5%, it should be 5%. And if you lower to 4%, you're just encouraging long-term investments, which are unviable, which is the boom. And those things are going to have to be wiped away because we don't have enough savings to support them. And that would be the bust. So what the Central Bank of Canada or the Fed in the U.S. should do is resign and allow the interest rate to be determined by supply and demand, as you were mentioning. And how do they do it now? Well, I don't know. They flip a coin, or more realistically, what they do. I don't know what it is in the Canadian Central Bank, but the Fed must have, I don't know, 500 or 5,000 economists who are employed by them.
Wow.
Who couldn't get jobs otherwise doing anything. And this is why central banks are very popular among economists, because it's a way of getting a job that otherwise you wouldn't be able to get. So I'm with Ron Paul. Ron Paul in the U.S., his famous statement is "End the Fed," and I'm a big fan of ending the Fed, and therefore I support Ron Paul on this. Well, look, this was a great half hour.
Absolutely. And I could probably chat with you all night long about this stuff. I could pick your brain entirely. I won't keep you. I want to thank you so much for coming on and giving a brief explainer on economics and the different schools of thought on economics. And well, hopefully we can chat again, because there's so many different things that I would love to ask you about and get people to have a better understanding of this. So thank you so much, Walter.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Take care.